3 weeks after my baby shower, I gave birth to a beautiful little girl. That same night, my mother-in-law told my husband, "A woman who cannot give this family a son is not the woman you were meant to marry." He believed her. Little by little, he pulled away, and before our daughter ever took her first steps, he abandoned us both. 18 months later, the applesauce was still on my sleeve when I saw him. Cereal aisle, Fred Meyer on Burnside, 6:40 on a Tuesday evening. I remember the time because I'd checked my phone 3 seconds before I looked up, calculating whether I could still make it to Lily's pediatrician appointment if I grabbed the oatmeal and got out fast. Store brand, the only kind I bought anymore. I had a coupon folded into my wallet for it, the kind you clip out of a mailer, and I was not embarrassed about that. Not really, except in moments like this one, when the life I'd built out of coupons and store brand cereal collided head-on with the life he'd built without me. Daniel Whitfield was standing 40 feet away in a pea coat that cost more than my rent, and beside him was a woman in a camel-colored wool coat with a diamond bracelet catching the fluorescent light, one hand resting on a belly that was maybe 6 months along, the other hand looped loosely through his arm like she'd done it 1,000 times, and never once had to think about it. I hadn't seen him in 18 months. Not since the morning he left with 2 suitcases and told me he needed space to think, which turned out to mean space to disappear into a life with someone whose father, I would later learn, owned 40% of a logistics company that did business with Daniel's mother's real estate holding firm. Space to think turned out to cost me $200 a month alone, with a 14-month-old daughter and a lease I couldn't break. Lily was on my hip, one fist wrapped in my hair, humming to herself the way she did when she was bored, and I felt her weight shift as she noticed the cereal boxes, bright colors at her eye level, and pointed. "Pink," she said. I didn't move. My hands, I noticed distantly, had started shaking, the applesauce stain on my sleeve trembling with them. Then his mother's cart rolled into view. Patricia Whitfield saw us before Daniel did. I watched her face do the thing it always did. The cold assessment first, quick and clinical. The kind of look you'd give a stain on a carpet you were deciding whether to bother cleaning. Then, because she was performing for an audience that included her son's pregnant girlfriend, the assessment melted into something warmer, something with teeth in it. "Well," she said, loud enough to carry over the cereal displays. "Look what the past dragged in." I held Lily tighter. She pressed her face into my neck, suddenly shy, the way she did around loud voices and strangers. The pregnant woman looked between us, confusion knitting her eyebrows. "Daniel?" she said. "Who is this?" "No one important," Patricia said, before her son could open his mouth. I laughed. One sharp sound, involuntary, surprising even me. All 3 of them turned. "Daniel," the woman said, slower this time, each word deliberate. "Who is she?" He swallowed. I watched his throat move. 18 months, and I could still read every tell he had, every hesitation, every rehearsed evasion warming up behind his eyes. "Marissa," he said. "This is Claire, my ex-wife." Marissa's gaze dropped to Lily, to the small dark head pressed against my collarbone. "And this is your daughter?" The silence that followed had actual weight to it. I felt it pressing against my sternum. Patricia tried to fill it, the way she filled every silence that threatened to say something true. That matter was settled privately. Claire agreed to move on. "No," I said. Daniel disappeared. "There's a difference." Marissa turned to him fully now, and I watched something behind her eyes go very still, like a door swinging shut on a draft. "You told me you didn't have children." I want to say his face showed grief. It didn't. It showed fear. Real fear. The first honest thing I'd seen on him in 2 years. "Marissa, I was going to tell you," he said. "When?" Her voice cracked down the middle. "After the baby's born?" Patricia stepped between them, physically, like her body was a wall that could hold back a sentence already spoken. "This is not a conversation for a grocery store." "No," I agreed. "It was a conversation for a hospital room, or a lawyer's office, or any of the 12 certified letters he ignored about child support." I felt the strap of my purse against my shoulder and thought, unbidden, of the envelope inside it. Bank transfers I'd never authorized labeled settlement, screenshots of texts that had turned ugly at 2 a.m., a voicemail he'd left drunk 8 months ago that said things he'd deny in daylight. I could have opened that purse right there, dumped 18 months of evidence onto the linoleum between the cereal and the peanut butter. I didn't. Lily tugged my hair and pointed again at the box of cereal, insistent now. "Pink," she said more firmly. I kissed her cheek. I looked at Marissa one last time. "You should ask him what else he's lied about," I said. Then I turned and walked toward the registers. My daughter's small hand fisted in my hair, my heart going so hard I could feel it in my ears, and I did not look back to see whether any of them were still watching. I need to back up because none of this makes sense without the part before it, the part where I actually believed for 3 years that Daniel Whitfield loved me. We met at a continuing education seminar for paralegals in Eugene, both of us bored out of our minds during a lecture on Oregon probate code, and he passed me a note that just said, "Is this guy even reading off his own slides?" And I laughed hard enough that the instructor stopped talking. That was Daniel at 26. Funny, a little reckless, the kind of person who made ordinary rooms feel less ordinary. I didn't know yet that his mother owned 3 commercial properties in the Pearl District and sat on the board of a foundation with her photograph in the gala program every spring. I found that out slowly, the way you find out a house has a cracked foundation, not all at once, but through small signs you keep explaining away. Patricia Whitfield did not approve of me from the first dinner. I was a paralegal, not an attorney. My mother had cleaned houses in Gresham for 30 years. I did not know at 24 which fork was for what, and Patricia made sure I knew that she'd noticed. But Daniel, in those years, was still still willing to stand between us. He'd steer conversations away from my background. He'd laugh off his mother's comments as just how she is. I told myself that was enough. I told myself a man who ran interference was a man who'd chosen me. We married when I was 27. Patricia gave a toast at the reception that mentioned, twice, how modern it was for Daniel to marry outside the usual circles. I laughed along with everyone else because that's what you do at your own wedding when the alternative is a scene. I got pregnant 2 years later. I remember the exact week. I was 30 weeks along and we were assembling a crib in the spare room, and Daniel put his hand on my stomach and said, "I hope it's a boy, so my mom will finally shut up," and laughed like it was a joke. I laughed too. It didn't feel like a joke even then, but I didn't have the vocabulary yet for what it actually was, which was a warning. Lily was born on a Thursday in March, 7 pounds 2 ounces, a full head of dark hair, screaming so loudly the nurse called her a real fighter. Patricia visited the hospital room 4 hours after the birth. I remember watching her walk to the bassinet, watching her look down at my daughter, my perfect screaming 7-pound daughter, and say nothing. No smile, no congratulations, just a long assessing silence, the same one I'd see again 18 months later in a cereal aisle. That night, exhausted, still bleeding, still raw from 20 hours of labor, I heard her in the hallway outside my room. She didn't know I was awake. She thought the door was closed further than it was. "A woman who cannot give this family a son," she told my husband, "is not the right wife for you." I heard Daniel say, "Mom, not here." That was it. That was his entire defense of me and his daughter, delivered in a hospital hallway 4 hours after I'd nearly died bringing his child into the world. Not here, not stop, not she's my wife, not that's my daughter you're talking about. Just a request for better timing, as if the problem with his mother's cruelty was its location, not its existence. I told myself it was nothing. New grandmother, old-fashioned values, the kind of thing that would soften once Patricia actually held her granddaughter. I was wrong, and some small, unignorable part of me already knew I was wrong, even as I told myself otherwise. The first 6 months, the changes were small enough to explain away. Daniel started working later, not dramatically, an extra hour here, a dinner meeting there, but the pattern accumulated the way water accumulates in a basement, quietly, until one day you notice the carpets soaked through. I told myself it was new father exhaustion, that some men process the terror of a newborn by burying themselves in work instead of diapers. I made him dinner on the nights he came home. I kept it warm in the oven on the nights he didn't. Then I found the calendar invite, not on his phone. I never went looking through his phone, a fact I'd later regret, because I'd spent 3 years being the kind of wife who trusted her husband, and it cost me 18 months of denial I could have skipped. I found it because his laptop was open on the kitchen counter and a Google Calendar reminder popped up. "Mom, Cascade Grove, 7 p.m. Do not bring C.C. Claire, me." I asked him about it that night, my voice as level as I could make it. He said it was just a business dinner with investors. Mom's idea, nothing personal. I told myself that made sense. Patricia ran in circles I didn't belong to. Country club fundraisers, real estate closings, the kind of rooms where I'd feel the temperature drop the second I walked in. Maybe it really was easier without me there. I made myself believe that because the alternative, that my husband and his mother were having dinners specifically designed to exclude me, was too ugly to hold. Lily's first birthday, Patricia sent a card, not to Lily, to Daniel, alone, no envelope with my daughter's name on it at all. Inside, in her looping, expensive handwriting, she'd written, "When you're ready to talk about the future of this family, I'm here. There's still time to make things right." I found it because Daniel left it on the counter, and I read it standing in my kitchen with my daughter's birthday cake, a grocery store cake, chocolate, because I hadn't had time to bake one, cooling on the counter beside it. I confronted him. I remember exactly what I said. "Make things right? How? What is she talking about?" He wouldn't look at me. She's stuck in an old way of thinking, Claire. Ignore it. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. I told myself that was honesty, at least. An admission that his mother's behavior baffled him too, that he was as helpless against her as I was. I didn't yet understand that helplessness and complicity can look identical from the outside, and that only one of them requires you to keep showing up to secret dinners. My hands shook that whole evening. I remember cutting the birthday cake and having to set the knife down twice because I couldn't hold it steady. By month 9, he'd started sleeping in the guest room, so the baby monitor wouldn't wake us both. I let that happen because I was exhausted too, because a full night's sleep felt like a mercy I didn't want to argue away, and because some part of me, the part still telling itself a story where this marriage survived, didn't want to examine too closely why my husband preferred a twin bed down the hall to the bed we'd shared for 3 years. Then I found the second calendar entry, same restaurant. This time the note said, "Discuss M options going forward. Bring paperwork. M." I didn't know an M yet. I wouldn't know her name, Marissa, for another 9 months. I asked Daniel who M was. He said it was a client, Claire. I have dozens of clients. I can't account for every meeting. His voice had an edge to it now, something sharper than the gentle evasions of 6 months earlier. I told myself the edge was stress, work stress, new father stress, mother stress. I told myself a lot of things that spring, most of them to avoid the one true thing sitting in the middle of the room, which was that my husband was building a life I wasn't invited into, one dinner at a time. I tried to fix it the only way I knew how. I suggested therapy. He said we didn't need it. I suggested a weekend away, just the two of us, my mother offering to take Lily. He canceled 2 days before, citing a work emergency that I later learned from a mutual friend's offhand comment had actually been a property closing for his mother's firm, the kind of thing he could have rescheduled if he'd wanted to. Month 12. Daniel missed Lily's 12-month pediatrician appointment, the one where they check developmental milestones, the one I'd asked him 3 times to put on his calendar. I sat alone in the waiting room of Dr. Patel's office, Lily on my lap chewing on a plastic giraffe, and texted him twice with no response. He came home at 9:40 that night, smelling faintly of a cologne I didn't recognize. Not his. Something sharper, more expensive. I asked where he'd been. Dinner with Mom, he said. Told you that. You didn't tell me that. You missed Lily's appointment. I said I was sorry about that. He hadn't. I remember standing in the kitchen doorway with the specific, sick certainty that I was watching a man mentally leave a room he was still standing in. His body was in our kitchen. The rest of him had already gone somewhere else. I tried one more time to fix it. I wrote him a letter, an actual letter because I couldn't get the words out any other way, and left it on his pillow in the guest room. I don't remember every line, but I remember the last one. I am not asking you to choose between me and your mother. I am asking you to choose your daughter. He never mentioned the letter, not once. I found it 3 weeks later in the guest room trash can, unfolded, like he'd read it and decided it didn't require an answer. Month 14, 2 weeks before Lily took her first steps her father never saw. Daniel came home with 2 suitcases already packed in the trunk of his car. He told me he needed space to think. He said it standing in the doorway, not fully inside the house, like he'd already decided the house wasn't his anymore and wanted to minimize contact with it. Think about what? I asked. Everything, he said. Us. What I actually want. You have a 14-month-old daughter, Daniel. This isn't a philosophy seminar. He didn't answer that. He picked up the second suitcase and left, and I stood in the doorway watching his taillights until they turned onto Burnside and disappeared. And then I went inside and checked on Lily, asleep in her crib, one small fist curled by her face, and I sat down on the floor of her room and did not cry. Not yet, because crying felt like it would take an energy I needed for something else. I just didn't know what yet. The certified letters started 3 months later when the informal support payments dried up. I sent 12 of them over the following year. 4 went unanswered entirely. 2 came back with responses from an attorney I'd never heard of, informing me that my client disputes the calculation of support obligations without offering an alternative calculation. The rest simply vanished into whatever address he was using, which changed twice in 14 months. I raised Lily alone on a paralegal's salary that didn't stretch as far as it needed to. Store brand oatmeal, grocery store birthday cakes, a rent I made every month by myself, sometimes 2 days late, always eventually paid. I did not know during any of that year that Daniel had a girlfriend, that she was pregnant, or that his mother had been managing the entire architecture of his disappearance from behind the scenes, one dinner and one calendar invite at a time. I found all of that out in a cereal aisle 18 months after he left, standing 40 feet from a woman in a camel coat who didn't yet know she was pregnant with a stranger's second chance at the exact same lie. The blocked number lit up my phone that night at 9:14 p.m. I almost didn't answer. I'd had enough shocks for one day and Lily was finally asleep, and I was sitting on my couch with a glass of wine I hadn't touched, replaying the cereal aisle on a loop I couldn't shut off. Claire, this is Marissa. I think we need to talk. Her voice was different than it had been in the store. Smaller, unsteady, none of the polish that the camel coat and the diamond bracelet had suggested. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment before I answered. Okay, I said. I'm listening. Not on the phone, she said. Can we meet? Somewhere neutral. I found some things. After you left, I went home and I couldn't stop thinking about what you said, so I looked. His email was still open on the shared computer. I searched your name, then I searched mine. Something in my chest went very still. What did you find? I don't want to say it over the phone, she said, and I heard her voice crack on the last word. Please, Claire. 2 days. There's a coffee shop by the river, the one on Naito Parkway. I'll bring everything. I said yes before I'd fully decided to. 2 days later, I sat across from her at a small table by the window, the Willamette gray and moving behind the glass. She'd come without the camel coat, without the bracelet, just a plain sweater, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she wasn't drinking, a leather folder pressed against her side like she was afraid it might be taken from her before she could hand it over. He told me you didn't want a family, she said before I'd even finished sitting down. He said the divorce was mutual. He said you were unstable after a miscarriage. The words hit me somewhere under the ribs. My daughter was alive. My daughter was at daycare 4 blocks from where I sat, alive and breathing and probably finger painting something I'd find crusted into her hair at pickup. There had never been a miscarriage. There had only ever been Lily. Present tense. A fact Daniel had apparently found so inconvenient to his new narrative that he'd erased her twice, once from his life and once from the story he told the woman replacing me in it. He erased her, I said. Marissa's eyes filled. Yes, she slid the folder across the table. My hands were steady this time, which surprised me, given how unsteady they'd been in the cereal aisle 2 days earlier. Maybe there's a point past which shock stops registering as shock and starts registering as information. Inside were printed emails, dozens of them, spanning back nearly 2 years, bank statements with transfers I recognized, the settlement payments that had never come with an actual settlement attached, routed not from Daniel's personal account, but from an LLC I didn't recognize, something called Cascade Grove Holdings, legal drafts with track changes, comments in the margins, and company names cross-referenced in a spreadsheet Marissa had apparently built herself over one sleepless night. Whitfield Properties, Patricia's firm, and Ashford Logistics, which I now understood was Marissa's father's company. Millions of dollars in shared contracts between the two families, dating back to before Daniel and Marissa had ever met. It wasn't a love story, Marissa said quietly, watching my face as I worked through the documents. I think I always knew that somewhere, but I didn't let myself look at it directly until 2 nights ago. Then I found the email that stopped my breath completely. From Patricia Whitfield to Daniel, dated 5 months after Lily was born. Subject line, moving forward. Keep Claire quiet until the deal is signed. No court, no public filings. Send money from my account if needed. I don't want your name on the transfers. Once you are remarried and have a proper heir, no one will care what she says. A proper heir. I read it 3 times. I looked up at Marissa, who was watching her own hand rest against the curve of her belly, her face gone very still and very pale. There's one more thing you need to know, she said, before you decide what to do with any of this. She reached into the folder and pulled out a single ultrasound photo, face down on the table between us. She didn't turn it over right away. Her fingers stayed pressed against the back of it for a long moment, like she was steadying herself or steadying me, or both. Daniel doesn't know this yet, she said. Neither does his mother. She turned it over and slid it across the table. Twins. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because the honest answer isn't the one that makes for a clean story. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt something closer to grief. Grief for Marissa, who was carrying 2 children into a family that had already shown me exactly what it did to daughters who weren't the proper outcome. And grief, unexpectedly, for the version of myself who'd once sat in a hospital hallway telling herself not here was a defense worth accepting. What are you going to do? I asked her. I don't know yet, Marissa said, but I know I'm not signing anything his mother sends me. And I know these two, her hand moved over her belly again, are not going to grow up thinking their existence is a business transaction that erased somebody else's kid to make room for them. I didn't fully believe sitting in that coffee shop that this would end anywhere clean, but I believed her in that moment, and it turned out that was enough to start. The first person I called was an attorney named Renata Ocampo, whom I'd worked alongside for 2 years as a paralegal before Lily was born, and whom I trusted the way you trust someone who's watched you cry in a break room and never once mentioned it afterward. Renata had spent 19 years practicing family law in Multnomah County, half of it running her own small firm on S.E. Hawthorne, and when I laid the folder out on her desk, she went quiet in a way I recognized, the quiet of someone recalculating the entire shape of a case in real time. This isn't just a support enforcement problem anymore, she said after 20 minutes of reading. This is fraudulent transfer, possibly witness tampering, depending on what keep Claire quiet actually translated to in practice. And if these payments were structured to avoid a paper trail specifically to interfere with a support order, that's a different conversation with the court entirely. What do I do with it? First, Renata said, we authenticate everything, then we file. And you should know, this is going to get uglier before it gets better. Patricia Whitfield has resources. She will fight. I told her I understood. I didn't. Not really. Not yet. Not the specific shape the ugliness would take. But I signed the engagement letter anyway. Renata brought in a forensic accountant named Marcus Ibatayo, who'd spent 11 years tracing shell company transfers for a mid-sized firm downtown before going independent, specifically to make sense of the LLC structure behind Cascade Grove Holdings. It took him 3 weeks to build a full picture. What he found was this. Patricia Whitfield had funneled just over $340,000 through Cascade Grove Holdings over 18 months, structured in amounts small enough to avoid the reporting thresholds that would have triggered automatic bank scrutiny. Some of it had gone to Daniel directly, disguised as loan repayments on a loan that, as far as Marcus could determine, had never actually existed as a documented transaction before the transfers began. Some of it, more troublingly, had gone toward retaining the attorney who'd sent me those 2 dismissive letters disputing my support calculations, meaning Patricia hadn't just been ignoring my legal attempts to secure support for Lily, she'd been actively bankrolling the opposition to them. This is one of the cleaner structuring cases I've seen, Marcus told me, in the flat, almost admiring tone of a man who spent his days looking at other people's financial dishonesty for a living. Cleaner doesn't mean legal. It means she thought she wouldn't get caught. The third person Renata brought in was Detective Inaya Kessler of the Portland Police Bureau's Financial Crimes Unit, 17 years on the force, the last 6 specifically investigating fraud and structured transaction cases. Detective Kessler was the first person in this entire process who looked at the proper heir email and didn't just react to the cruelty of it. She reacted to its evidentiary value. This email is a gift, she told me, during our first meeting in a police bureau conference room that smelled like old coffee and printer toner. Most people who do this kind of thing are smart enough not to put it in writing. Patricia Whitfield wasn't. Kessler explained what would happen next in terms I mostly already understood from my paralegal work, but hearing them applied to my own life made them land differently. There would be subpoenas for the full financial records of Cascade Grove Holdings. There would be a forensic review of the support order interference, which crossed from a family court issue into something closer to obstruction, given the deliberate structuring to avoid a paper trail. And there would, almost certainly, be a parallel civil case, the one Renata was already building, for the child support arrears, now recalculated to include interest and legal fees Patricia's interference had directly caused me to incur. I sat in Kessler's office and watched her write Exhibit D on a sticky note attached to a printed copy of the proper heir email, and I felt something in my chest that wasn't quite relief, but was adjacent to it. The specific, grounding sensation of watching a system that had ignored me for 18 months finally start paying attention. Not everyone believed me right away, and I think that's important to say honestly, because the story doesn't work if I pretend every official I met immediately took my side. The first family court commissioner I appeared before, at an emergency hearing to modify the support order, was a man named Commissioner Alan Reyes, who'd clearly seen hundreds of contentious custody and support disputes, and had developed over the years a healthy skepticism toward dramatic claims of conspiracy. When Renata presented the proper heir email, Reyes read it twice, slowly, and then looked at me over his glasses. "Ms. Whitfield," he said, "I'd kept Daniel's name for Lily's sake, a decision I was starting to regret purely for the confusion of sharing a surname with the people trying to erase us. I want to be careful here. An ugly email is not, by itself, proof of a criminal conspiracy. It could reflect one person's opinion, expressed poorly, and nothing more." I understood his caution. I'd have wanted the same caution applied to any case I'd worked on as a paralegal, before all of this became personal. What changed his mind wasn't the email alone. It was Marcus's forensic accounting, laid out transfer by transfer, showing that Patricia's ugly words in that email had been followed, methodically, by exactly the actions described in it. The email predicted a pattern. The pattern arrived on schedule. Reyes granted the emergency modification. He also, notably, referred the financial evidence to the DA's office for review of possible criminal charges related to the structured transfers. A step Renata told me afterward was not nothing, coming from a commissioner as cautious as Reyes. The second person who doubted me was, unexpectedly, my own mother, not because she doubted the facts, but because she was terrified of what fighting Patricia Whitfield would cost me. "That family has lawyers on retainer, Claire," she told me over the phone, her voice tight with a fear I recognized because I'd been carrying a version of it myself for 18 months. What if this backfires? What if she comes after custody? I understood the fear. I sat with it for a full night before I answered her, because it deserved a real answer, not a reflexive one. What I told her, eventually, was this. Patricia Whitfield had already spent 18 months trying to erase her granddaughter quietly, through silence and structured payments and an email that called my daughter's existence an obstacle to a proper heir. The choice in front of me wasn't between safety and risk. It was between a quiet erasure I'd already survived and a loud reckoning I might actually win. My mother didn't fully stop worrying, but she started showing up to hearings. The crisis peak came 6 weeks into the case, on a Thursday, when Renata called me at work with a voice I'd never heard her use before. Clipped, fast, all business. "Patricia's attorney filed an emergency motion this morning," she said. "They're alleging you coached Marissa to fabricate the documents. They're asking the court to seal the financial records pending an investigation into whether Marissa illegally accessed Daniel's email. If that motion succeeds, everything Marcus found becomes inadmissible. We have a hearing in 24 hours. 24 hours. I remember doing the math on instinct, the way you do when panic needs a concrete shape to attach itself to. 24 hours to somehow prove that Marissa's discovery of the emails had been incidental, not orchestrated, that I hadn't manufactured a case out of another woman's marriage falling apart in convenient proximity to mine. I called Marissa that night. She was 7 months pregnant by then, exhausted, and I could hear in her voice that she'd already guessed why I was calling before I explained it. "I'll testify," she said before I'd finished asking. "I'll tell them exactly how I found it. The computer, the shared login, all of it. I have the browser history timestamp if they need proof I wasn't looking for anything until after the grocery store. They're going to come after you in that hearing, Marissa, hard." "I know," she said. "I'm still doing it. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed listening to Lily's white noise machine hum through the monitor and ran through every version of the next day's hearing I could imagine, most of them bad. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, even lying still, even in the dark. A low tremor that felt less like fear and more like a current running through me that had nowhere else to go. The hearing itself lasted 3 hours. Patricia's attorney, a sharp, unbothered man named Griffin Vance, argued that Marissa's access to Daniel's email constituted unauthorized computer access under Oregon law, and that any evidence derived from it should be excluded as fruit of an illegal search, a private party analog, he claimed, to constitutional exclusionary rules that don't technically apply between private citizens, a distinction Renata pounced on immediately. "Mr. Vance is asking this court to apply a Fourth Amendment framework to a private domestic dispute," Renata said, standing at the table beside me, her voice even and unhurried in a way that steadied something in my own chest just to hear it. "Ms. Ashford accessed a shared household computer, using credentials she had legitimate, ongoing access to as a resident of that household. There is no unauthorized access here. There is a woman who discovered, in her own home, evidence that her partner had been deceiving her about the existence of his own child." Marissa testified for 40 minutes. Vance tried repeatedly to suggest that she and I had coordinated the discovery in advance, that the grocery store encounter had been staged. Marissa's answer to that, delivered without raising her voice, was the moment I understood the hearing had turned. "I met Claire for the first time in a cereal aisle 2 months ago," she said. "I didn't know her name until Daniel said it. I didn't know he had a daughter until I saw her. Everything after that was me, alone, at midnight, looking at my own life on a shared computer because a stranger told me to ask my partner what else he'd she'd lied about. Nobody coached me to feel betrayed. I got there myself. Commissioner Reyes denied the motion to seal. The financial evidence stood. What came after wasn't a single dramatic collapse. It was several smaller ones, arriving over the following 2 months in a sequence that felt, by the end, almost anticlimactic, which I've come to think is closer to how justice actually works than the version you see in movies. The Multnomah County DA's office filed charges against Patricia Whitfield for structuring financial transactions to evade reporting requirements, along with a related charge tied to the interference with a court-ordered support obligation. She retained a defense attorney with a reputation for negotiating favorable pleas for white-collar clients, and 6 weeks later, she accepted a plea agreement, restitution of the full $340,000 Marcus had traced, a 5-year probationary period, and a formal admission on the record that the transfers had been structured specifically to conceal them from support enforcement scrutiny. No prison time. I'd expected to feel angrier about that than I actually did. What I felt instead, reading the plea agreement Renata forwarded me, was a kind of tired satisfaction. The specific relief of watching a lie that had cost me 18 months finally exist, officially, on paper, as a lie. Daniel's employer, a mid-sized commercial real estate firm where he'd worked as an associate broker, a job I later learned his mother had arranged for him 3 years earlier through a client relationship, placed him on administrative leave once the DA's filing became public record, and terminated him 2 weeks after that, citing conduct inconsistent with firm standards, language vague enough to mean almost anything, and specific enough that everyone who read it understood exactly what it meant. The revised support order came through with retroactive arrears, interest, and Renata's legal fees included, structured as a lien against Daniel's portion of a trust his father had left him, a trust Patricia had apparently been managing with an unusual amount of discretion for a document that was legally his son's. It would take years to fully collect. I'd made peace with that before the ink was dry. Some debts get paid in installments. What mattered to me wasn't the speed. It was that the number was finally real, finally documented, finally attached to a court order with actual teeth in it. Marissa left Daniel 4 days after the plea agreement became public. She didn't need my urging or Renata's advice or anyone's permission. She simply looked at the full accounting of who he'd been for the entire time she'd known him and decided she didn't want her children to grow up inside that particular architecture. She moved in with her sister in Beaverton. She kept the twins. I saw her once more before the case fully closed, at a follow-up deposition where we happened to arrive at the same time. She was full term by then, moving slowly, one hand pressed to the small of her back. "I'm naming one of them Claire," she told me in the elevator, almost shyly, like she wasn't sure if the gesture would land as touching or strange. "Middle name, if that's all right with you." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just said thank you, and I meant it more than the words probably conveyed. Lily is 3 now. She has Daniel's dark hair and my mother's stubborn chin, and she does not remember, and will likely never fully understand, the 18 months when her father decided a daughter wasn't the outcome his family had been hoping for. I still work as a paralegal, though I switched firms. I work with Renata now, part-time, which felt like the right kind of closure, learning to build the same cases from the other side of a desk I used to sit at as an employee. Some evenings, after Lily's asleep, I pull the old envelope out of the drawer where I still keep it. The bank transfers, the screenshots, the voicemail transcript, not because I need it anymore, but because there's something steadying about remembering exactly how heavy it used to feel to carry, and exactly how light it feels now that it's just paper. Patricia sent one letter, 8 months after the plea agreement, addressed to Lily, care of me. I haven't opened it. I don't know if I ever will. Some doors, once they've told you clearly enough what's on the other side of them, don't need to be reopened just because someone finally decided to knock. Marissa and I still talk, occasionally, nothing regular, just a text now and then, a photo of the twins on their birthday, a check-in around the holidays. We didn't choose each other. A cereal aisle and a shared careless man chose us, and somehow what came out the other side of that wasn't rivalry, but something closer to reluctant alliance. 2 women who'd both been handed the same lie in different wrapping paper and had decided, independently, not to keep it. Last week, Lily and I were in a grocery store, a different one, on the other side of town. Not out of superstition exactly, but because some habits form without your permission. And she pointed at a box of cereal in the aisle and said, "Pink," the same word she'd said 18 months and a lifetime ago. Standing on my hip 40 feet from the wreckage of everything I used to believe about the man I married, I put the pink box in the cart. Some things, I've learned, really are that simple, once you stop letting someone else decide what they're allowed to cost.